Hello, and welcome to the Biomass and Pellet Milk Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Anna Simet, and on today's episode, I have with me Brandi Colander, Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Enviva. Brandi, hello, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely, it's our pleasure. So, Brandi, at Enviva, your role is maintaining and enhancing Enviva's sustainability and environmental stewardship efforts. So let's start today by talking a little bit more about this. So why don't you tell us what is the role of education in your sector and your current position?
I think Enviva is one of these really exciting and pioneering companies. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think when you think about disruptors and when you think about companies that have actually pioneered, in the truest sense of the word, developed industries and sectors, Enviva is one of those. And so one of the things that drew me to this opportunity was to be able to help shape a company as it continued to grow and mature and scale. And they're really very anchored and centered on being able to provide a renewable, regenerative resource through primary wood pellets and to be able to generate energy, and where I think we're all increasingly more sensitive to thoughtful about climate change and mitigation as a result of climate change. A company like Enviva that has very closely aligned its core tenets with being able to mitigate climate change by using a renewable regenerative resource has to, at its core, educate people about why it exists, what they sought to do when they sort of founded the company, and what they're learning along the way. And so just to sort of get a little bit more mechanic, when we think about forestry, which obviously, if we're going to be in the business of dealing with trees, we are going to have to be pretty codependent on healthy forests. And so I think with that understanding, you will better appreciate the investment that the company has made in conservation. You will better understand why we have really critical third-party stakeholders that are also very aligned when it comes to conservation and understanding the sustainability tenets. But frankly, and this is sort of my bias, having gone to the Yale School of Forestry, a lot of folks are of two different schools of thought. And one is, a tree is a tree, leave it be. The other is, a tree stands tall with a forest and it can grow because it's being managed in a healthy, sustainable way. And so forest management is really the core education that I think is critical if you're trying to really navigate a company like Enviva. And it's no different, frankly, from anyone who uses paper or toilet paper or anything in the forest products sector.
Exactly. Bioenergy is a fascinating industry right now. What excites you about the current energy landscape?
So many things. I mean, it used to be that we really couldn't see beyond the traditional forms of energy. Do we have to drill to the core of the earth to be able to live a certain way? And now, of course, it's really exciting to see what's happening in terms of scaling solar and scaling wind. And I've had a front row seat, having served in different sectors and served on the regulatory side, having served in a previous administration, and being able to help facilitate the nation's first offshore wind facilities. And in each iteration of a new technology, I'm always thinking, if you're serious about climate change, you understand that you need it all, right? You want a diverse pool of resources and tools that can be utilized in order to be able to really live the way we want to live, like fully self-actualize in this life and be able to have choice in how we live. And you can't rely on any one sole resource, because the moment you do that, now you're not actually operating sustainably because you're over-dependent on that one resource and it gets exploited inherently, right? Specific to the future of Enviva and the many directions that I think the company can continue to scale and grow, there's an opportunity when we hear the current administration here domestically to think about how we can have an impact in aviation. We think about sustainable aviation fuels and who could be a very ideal feedstock with built infrastructure to support the scaling of that. When we think about the harder to abate sectors and who is a perfectly positioned company to add a drop in replacement for coal and other fossil fuels for sectors like cement, steel, lime, et cetera. And so I think Enviva has so much potential. Obviously, why I'm here. And I believe that, it's one of the resources from a biomass and regenerative renewable energy resource pool that is only positioned well to scale.
Great answer. So, Brandi, in our industry, there are a lot of misconceptions. What do you wish people understood about biomass?
I would start with tree management, forest management practices that I would actually encourage them to look outside of Enviva to understand those, right? I would look at academic institutions. I would look at organizations like the U.S. Endowment, like Earthworm Preferred by Nature. I mean, there are so many organizations, Society of American Foresters. I mean, there's so many organizations that are not, frankly, their business model is not one around advocacy. Their business model is actually around conservation. And so if you really want to understand the sustainability of technologies that require natural resources, you have to get to know the conservation organizations that do that work every day. And I say this having actually spent time in advocacy organizations and have tremendous respect for them. I also am fully appreciative of the work that conservation organizations do with businesses to support scaled opportunities to provide resources to customers in a thoughtful way that has multiple stakeholders that are a part of that input. So I think I would go back to sort of that early education around forest management practices. You look at sort of what's happening in the country around wildfire season, and it's devastating, honestly. A lot of that is because you have unmanaged forest. And so there's brush that's easy to catch flame, and now it's completely uncontrolled. One of the things that's exciting about a company like Enviva is we have effectively created a market for resources in the forest, which include brush, slash, trees that are, small in diameter and would have absolutely no utility at a sawmill, and they would get a ton more money for it if it were actually to meet sawmill criteria. Those are now resources that instead of getting burned in open fields, now actually have another life, currency, and it's helpful for forest management practices. It's also incredibly helpful at a time where the geopolitical landscape has really, in a devastating way, changed the energy needs abroad.
Those are some great points. So let's shift gears just a bit. Brandi, who are some of Enviva's primary stakeholders?
So I mentioned a couple of them earlier on. I think the Earthworm Foundation it holds tension, and I say this very purposefully. It holds the tension of pulling together stakeholders who sincerely care about resource management, but are coming to the table with different equities that they're trying to advance. And I think they're really just really thoughtful, brilliant partners that do this work around the globe. And one of the things that anyone who's in business will tell you that as you're pioneering and looking to new markets and trying to understand how you can navigate in new spaces, you need credible folks who understand the cultural dynamics, who understand who are the right people to pull into this conversation. And we have found tremendous support from organizations like the Earthworm Foundation. Another I'll mention is the U.S. Endowment, and they're really incredible partners. And I would encourage people to check out our website where we talk about our conservation commitment with them. But just being able to continue to scale that partnership. And I mention these two in particular because, frankly, we didn't just start working with them. They far predate me, who's new to the organization. We've been working with them for years. And I think that the beauty of working for years with third parties is you get really honest with one another around what's working, what's not working, and frankly, where maybe you've made some mistakes and there's an opportunity to course correct. And that's a good thing, right? That's the whole reason we're investing in one another.
So, Brandi, what trends are you noticing in your role?
So I would say this is not my first experience in a sustainability leadership role. And I think I often draw a parallel between CSOs today and sort of chief human resource officers 20 years ago. I think that you're still having some folks question what it needs to look like, if it needs to be its own independent role, how it's resourced, what experience they need to have, if it's sort of an internal loyalist versus someone who actually has credibility and training from a sustainability perspective. And I think it's really fascinating and dynamic. I obviously have my own opinions around that, but I will say,
Right.
the trend is that there is more adoption of having someone internally who's thoughtful and who intimately understands the business. I also think there's more increasingly of a trend, including people who have credibility in the space and training and working through third parties to make sure that they're staying current and present, and also to make sure that they're helping third parties who are not a part of your business, right? To understand the business. The truth in any advocacy, and I learned this early on in my advocacy chapters, is if you really don't understand the business, you hit walls quickly in advocacy. And the ultimate reality is all end users in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
We all expect the lights to come on when we flip the switch, right? And
Mhm.
so when those expectations are unrealized, the advocacy can only go so far if you don't fully understand the business. And so I think chief sustainability officers will continue to develop strategic partnerships to be able to make sure that there's a sort of symbiotic loop there of being able to help one another through blind spots. And when there's a genuine commitment to facilitating change, they'll become longstanding partnerships. Another trend I'm noticing is even though there is a lot of conversation and it's not always comfortable conversation around the acronym like ESG, I do believe that some configuration of the tenets of ESG are here to stay, largely because at their core, environmental considerations, societal and social considerations, governance considerations, those are all things that inherently are impacting your bottom line. They're just the negative externalities that might not have a line item in your budget, right? And so anyone who's smart about protecting their business is going to keep those guardrails implemented somewhere.
Right.
And I think that the folks who do that well will be first at the toll gate, and the folks who don't will be voluntold.
Right. So before we wrap this up, for any folks or interested in the space that you're in, or other CSOs, do you have any thoughts or advice to offer them?
Yeah, I think we still are searching for community. I think that, it's one of the places where you think about a tea bag that needs to be constantly steeped in hot water so that you can sort of just stay current. And I think that there's a support system that's necessary for CSOs because, frankly, people are passionate about the issues. And I think that gives them license to think they know what you should be doing all the time.
Right.
Perhaps not realizing that you've been thoughtful about your role and you have a remit and there is accountability around that remit. And I do think that there is some creep around mission with sustainability practitioners that can be really challenging. And so sometimes you're fitting the mold of a predecessor. Sometimes you're fitting the mold of shaping comms and narrative. So I think most CSOs would be well served to figure out what their support system looks like to develop their community. I also would encourage them to find and seek very actively opportunities to stay engaged in the messaging, the conversations about the work that they're shepherding forward. These things change a lot, but the core tenets don't. And so I think, being able to stay engaged and relevant however you see fit is one thing that's important to do because you want to show that your company is considerate of change, because a lot of this does deal with change, but is not willing to change so much that you can't count on commitments that are made, relationships that are established, et cetera. And I think often there's influence of sort of developing a new tagline, a new mousetrap. And at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is better align those negative externalities, make sure they're adequately accounted for, build credibility. And then the last thing that I think is really important is developing data management and systems that create good guardrails for your company to continue to operate accordingly.
Very good. That's some great advice, Brandi. Really have enjoyed our discussion today. Before we say goodbye, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, first of all, I'm just really appreciative of the interest. I think that this company has grown and evolved tremendously. And, I again am new to the company, and we have a new leader that was also a co-founder. And so I think it's a particularly exciting and dynamic time at Enviva. And I would hope that folks, look for us and better understand and join us on our journey. I also would hope that more folks become interested and committed to building sustainability teams and leaders that really do align with the core mission of their organizations. I think we'll be a better world if that's the case.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on behalf of Biomass Magazine and Pellet Mill Magazine, Brandi, and I hope that we can have you back sometime in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
You bet. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I know I sure did. Until next time.